Medicine and Life Sciences special session. We're very excited to see you all and to bring together in person this large and diverse international scholarly community, which now has more than 300 members. So we've got a real wealth of people and knowledge in this group. My name is Andrew Hogan. I am the current chair of the forum. And I want to recognize and thank our steering committee members who have contributed in many ways to our session today and making it happen. That includes our secretary, Robin Scheffler, Gina Sarita, our member at large, and our two graduate student representatives, Mary Kate Wolkin and Udoduri Akwandu. And I also want to say later this month we're going to be holding nominations and an election for another at-large member, so consider it or let people know if you know somebody who might be interested in joining us. So the Forum for the History of Health, Medicine, and Life Sciences exists to bring together and to support scholars who are working at the intersections of the history of science and the history of medicine, as well as those who integrate body, gender, sexuality, disability, animal, and environmental studies, among other things, into the history of science, technology, and medicine's canons. And in choosing our distinguished speaker for this year, we looked for a scholar whose contributions exemplify the most innovative current work that engages with perspectives and approaches from many of these often too disparate fields. Therefore, we're very excited to introduce Dr. Lan A. Lee, Assistant Professor in the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, as our annual Forum for the History of Health, Medicine, and Life Sciences distinguished speaker. Dr. Lee completed their PhD at MIT in History, Anthropology, and Science Technology Studies, and then served as a presidential scholar in Society and Neuroscience at Columbia University. They also taught in the Medical Humanities program as a history faculty member at Rice University. Lee is an accomplished historian in many areas who makes exciting connections among the histories of health, medicine, and life sciences across the 19th and 20th century. So we're very excited to have them here with us. Professor Lee's book, Body Maps, Improvising Meridians and Nerves in Global Chinese Medicine, which is forthcoming with Johns Hopkins University Press. All right, awesome. Is a fascinating cross-cultural comparison of the interplay of the body maps produced by practitioners of Chinese medicine and neurophysiology. Lee is currently embarking on a similarly wide-ranging study of numbness. They're also actively involved in influential health humanities presentations and analysis through film, podcast, and other exhibitions. So check those out. And so we're thrilled then to introduce Dr. Lee today to present their talk, Measure Your Meridians, Distance and Time in Global East Asian Anatomy. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Andy, for that really generous introduction and for the invitation to present this morning. My name is Lan Lee. I'm a historian of medicine, trained pretty broadly in STS and also had a postdoc in neurosciences and humanities. So my approach is quite sprawling, but one of the primary questions that I deal with focus on what Andy just mentioned, which is global East Asian anatomy. But this morning, I think this talk, because we're quite early in the day, it's also known as morning math. We're going to do just a tiny bit of math because we are measuring meridians. I've got some laid out in the form of ribbons, so I'll talk more about methods. But even this approach to thinking about meridians and time is considering how these paths, these anatomical paths in the body are both units of distance and units of time. And furthermore, units of time serve as units of life, and understanding and translating some of these sources I'll be sharing with you today involve a few forms of creative methodology, including just mapping these out and then using these maps to ask more questions. So this is, again, a small part of the book project that will be released next fall, and what I'll be presenting today is actually a footnote in the book for the next 40 minutes. So it's just a small part of the bigger project. So meridians. This word is pretty contested among sinologists. There's a group of sinologists from the 70s who hate this translation, and it's meant to describe these paths that you see here. These are three different kinds of images, but they're all modern images of meridian paths. This is a reproduction of a 14th century image in the 1950s. This is a new image from the 1930s, and here this is a lithograph from the 1950s. So it's a broad range of different kinds of graphic representations, but it's anchored in these hand-drawn lines, and they're used to represent what are known as jingluo and jingmai. So these two words, again, I mentioned sinologists struggle with this translation of meridians because they assume that by translating jingluo and jingmai, which are these paths, deny them of their materiality. But what I like to do is not so much think of meridians as a translation of the term, but instead think about it as the graphic representation of these invisible paths, because they can't be visualized otherwise. They're always hand-drawn. They always appear in these hand-drawn images and in the form of lines. So what I'm thinking through in the bigger book project is that meridians are a metaphorical term. So I draw a lot in critical cartography. So they're a metaphorical term to describe graphic representations of jingluo and jingmai. And if you've read Shigeki Sekirama's Expressiveness of the Body, he does talk about mo paths as pulses, and they're flesh pulses that move in the body. But when I talk about meridians, I'm talking about how they're represented, because these images have a pretty long life. They've been relatively consistent, but also expansive over the course of 10 centuries. Furthermore, limiting my analysis to meridians as graphic representations acknowledges both their materiality and invisibility of these corporeal structures, and it also highlights how visual genres have shaped historical discussions of ontology and location. So I'm trying to narrow my focus. Again, this is not a translation per se. There is utility to keeping the Romanized form of jingluo and jingmai, but talking about meridians allows me just to specifically describe the images and their process of production. So a couple notes on graphic representations and visual genres. We know in the history of science that there is a wealth of literature on images. We have, of course, representation in scientific practice. We have Tim Ingold's book on lines, Sachiko Kusukawa's book picturing the book of nature, and of course, Dave Kaiser's work on theoretical physics, drawing theories apart, looking at Feynman diagrams. But it's interesting to think about how this may or may not align with, or may or not apply to scholarship in East Asian medicine. So there are particular kinds of images that are, of course, culturally produced and culturally grounded, but the challenges of my work is bridging scholarship in the history of science with East Asian studies. And the way that I've done that is through art history, looking at images. But what I found in terms of thinking about graphic representations is that art history wasn't offering me a way to think about visual genres, and I was instead turning to literary studies. So I found that literary studies allowed me to focus on the relationship between form, action, and ontology. And this is building on work by Carolyn Miller, who pioneered work on genre as social action. And more recently, Anis Bawarchi's expansion on genre function to think about the provocative responses that images command. So this is just a way for me to think about, well, what do I mean when I say genre? And literary studies has offered a way to think with genre. Specifically, the genre I'm focusing on is genre of a tool. So these are, I mentioned, hand-drawn images, and they're specific to these East Asian contexts, and more specifically, meridian paths only live in tool. They only live in this kind of image. They're somewhat cartoonish. They're not objects of fine art. They're not photographs. They're not realistic images. They're artisanal products. So they're also known as these templates for action. They're meant to be these technical images that guide the imagination. So as you'll see, they are quite cartoonish, but they live again. They make sense because they exist as this graphic genre. One thing I do want to say is that this word tool has increasingly, historically, now has become more capacious. Now it includes all sorts of images, including photographs in the cenophone world, but historically, tool specifically relates to these hand-drawn, rough, cartoonish line drawings. So that's something that I also look at in my work, where even if we have meridians as paths, they overlay this kind of Renaissance realistic shading of the surface of the body. So genres can map on top of each other. They can layer on each other like a palimpsest. So just a little bit more on framing. So graphic genres, I'm also thinking about how they manifest what Wittgenstein has called life forms, and this allows me to think about ideological stereotypes, generic types, and different forms of media for organizing social action. And furthermore, generic anatomical images that that are broadly defined. And I sit with this idea of generic anatomical images because my work not only includes meridian paths, but also other kinds of organs that are problematic in biomedicine, including the spleen and the ocean of sway that's in the head and down the spine. So I think about, this is just one of the many kinds of generic anatomical images that I deal with. But they present stereotypical forms that register as didactic atlases that require one to act. And I'm thinking about acting broadly, again, quite broadly. So this could be reading, interpreting, etc. But when you think about meridian tool, I'm thinking about how these are handmade forms of life that are referencing lots of different things. It's a quite expansive cosmology. They're referencing distance, location, and temporality, which might not seem obvious given that we just, they're just lines on paper. But they're embedded within a broader way of thinking about how different flows are traveling in the body. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So this image, most of these atlases, they're quite recognizable. Like this form of the meridian tool has appeared across many different varieties, many different versions, many different languages, but increasingly it's narrowly applied to the idea of acupuncture practices. So if you think about these paths, usually the way I explain them to people is that they facilitate forms of healing and forms of heating. So the word acupuncture actually refers to two kinds of practices. It refers to both the insertion of a needle, and needles have gotten thinner and thinner over time, but also cauterization. So acupuncture is just a Latin word for poking with a needle, but it refers to two kinds of practices, zhen and jiu. So this is quite troubling for contemporary neuroscientists who try to explain what acupuncture is, because it's paired with mechanosensory input, like poking someone with a needle, and also applying heat. So if you think about what, for neuroscientists, these are two different kinds of pathways in the body. First is, one is heat, and another one is more mechanosensory, but they also can treat really similar kinds of issues. So for moxa, for instance, applying heat, it can treat things like nasal congestion, whooping cough, asthma, coughing up blood, pneumonia, hypertension, pleurisy, gallstones, colon ulceration, bloody defecation, cholera, diabetes, insomnia, beriberi, malaria, epilepsy, nosebleeds, tonsillitis, diphtheria, blood clotting, facial nerve palsy. This list of issues are from a 1950s textbook specifically on moxa in rural China. So if you have any of these issues, please let me know. But this is just to think about how broad, kind of the broad sets of issues these practices can address. But what's also interesting is that because of its broad therapeutic application, a lot of biomedical physicians who turn to Chinese medicine keep on asking, well, what are meridians? If they can do all these things, if they can address inflammation across the body, what are they? And from the 19th to 20th century, this has manifested in how meridians are translated, or jingluo are translated. Maybe they're vessels, maybe they're channels, maybe they're tracts, blood, forms of qi, maybe they're nerves. And because this practice of fixing what meridians are, or what jingluo are, because it's paired with therapeutics, it's also increasingly, most people turn to the images. And so this question of what meridians are gets conflated with this question of, or they answer this question with where meridians are, where they appear on the page, where they might be found on the body. So in terms of these paths, they move from, they're like 12 to 14 sets, and these number of paths are relatively consistent over the course of 10 centuries, but they move from the head through the torso to the feet to the hands. So one thing that's interesting with a lot of these images is that they're highly cartographic. They're cartographic in the sense that many images of meridians, or a number of images of meridians, often appear as if they are topographical maps. This image is from the 13th century, and Shigehisa Kurama, I first came across him in one of Shigehisa Kurama's articles, and my colleague Yang helped me find this Japanese version. It's a Japanese copied manuscript of this image from the 13th century. And it's attributed to this self-taught physician Wang Hao. So these texts will tell you where you can find meridians. It will see on either side of this image, there's text that tells you where you can find them. And this is pretty standard. Like they move from the hands to the head, from the torso to the hands, from the head to the feet, from the feet to the chest, from the hands to the head to the feet, from the hands to the stomach to the chest to the hands, and this is the natural correlation of heaven and earth. So it lays out its location of these movements pretty in a relatively straightforward way. And even in this image, and I've been spending more time on this recently, realizing that I need to think more about how to translate parts of it, but it also includes different parts of the body. So it shows you where the eyes are, where the ears are, where the feet are, and these are all individual meridian paths. So I mentioned that these paths are, they usually appear as cartographic objects, and even in texts that introduce meridians, they'll also describe what the proportions of particular parts of the body, what the topography of the body looks like, and usually the bodies are described as facing up, so they're flat, either facing up or facing down. So this is a representation or reproduction of the 1930s of a 14th century text. So you can see how these images are reproduced over and over and over again. But something that's interesting about these images is that they'll tell you the distance between parts of the body using an interesting unit of measurement. So it'll tell you, the distance between the ears is 1 foot 3 inches. It's quite, I don't know if that's the distance between my ears. Distance between the cheeks is 7 inches. And then on the arms, the text also describes, well, people also range in size, so take measurements according to the body. Long and short inches vary from infants to the elderly. But the primary unit of measurement that this text is based on is this unit called a twin. So this unit is actually the crease between your middle metatarsal. So it's the crease between your fingers. It's not super easy to access. Some people use the outside of the bone, but really it's inside of the bone. And it is with this unit that I've tried to measure out my own meridians, and we'll get to that in a second. So measuring your meridians. And this is where we move from global Asian medicine to thinking about distance, time, and making life. But a twin, this is roughly, it's not really an inch, some people call it a flexible inch, so I've just put it in quotations. This is in terms of how it accumulates, it creates a ch, which is 10 twin. And you can maybe think of it as a foot. It's not really a foot. I grew up, my parents had these twin-based rulers at home, and I would use them for my math assignments as a kid, and I'd always get all the measurements wrong. Yeah. So, but this is, so 10 twin is a ch, and then 10 ch creates a zhang, which I call a megameter. I'm not really sure. I tried to create, like, here's like a twin, this tiny bit, the twin. Then here is this like kind of a foot, and then this is I tried to have 10 of these, and it's quite long. So something like a megameter. That's a technical term. So what's interesting about this maybe inch, maybe foot, maybe megameter is that this is it's all flexible. Based on your body, based on how you apply it. Even this word, twin, historically used to refer to a millet seed. So what it even materially described has changed up over time. And I think it was stabilized around the 7th century. And even then it remains flexible. So we can apply these units of measurement to this image. And in another version of this text, Wang Haogu lists out, he's citing on older texts, but he describes, or he translates or reproduces this description of how long the meridians are. And this gets into measuring your meridians. Again, you can see that they are, they're hand meridians because they move from hands to the feet. They're feet meridians, and these two meridians are divided they're divided as yang and as yin. So they're classified differently. They do different things. There are also two Qiao meridians, which I'm not really sure what the Qiao meridians do, and then the Ren and the Du meridians, they circle from the front to the back of the body. You can also see that it tells you how long each are. So this is 5 twin here, which maybe again is maybe an inch. And then it also shows you the Chi, which again is maybe a foot. And then Zhang, which is maybe a megameter. And then let's see if we can actually map this out. So this is where I will need some assistance, Andy, if you please. So I've mapped all these out, and I will need also some assistance from the audience. So I've mapped these out here, and Andy, if you could just hold this like this with the yellow facing up. Yeah. Just stand over here. We'll pull each out one by one. I will try to not trip on all these wires. So 3 yang meridians are 5 Chi. So if you could hold this, and if you want to come closer, this is the yang hand meridian. You can hold this. And then there is the yin hand meridian. It's a little shorter. Here is that. If you, I don't know, maybe you can hold it with your other hand, because we have many other thermal pads. And then there's the yang feet meridian. Yang pads are really long. And I think I used way too much ribbon. I ran out. Okay, here we go. So if you can hold this one and try to pull it back as long as you can. So these are my meridians, just so be careful with them. All right, so here, and then here's another yin. These are the feet meridians. So as you can tell, it's a little shorter, so you hold that there. And then, let's see, we've got the Qiao meridians, which is the green one. Let's see, Qiao, and then I've got the yellow here. Is that you do? Okay, cool. So we'll leave one more person maybe over here. Okay, cool. And then these, so they reflect on either side of the body. So let me just put this mic down. So as you can tell, it's quite long. It's very proportional to me. Yeah. So if you can hold it there for a minute, let me just stay where you are. Stay where you are. I'll explain. It all makes sense. Okay. So these lengths, they all add up. So they're supposed to actually connect in the body, and they connect and they add up to 1,620 twin. So 16 zhang, 2 尺, 2 尺. And I also tried to, I had this whole idea where I would create a continuous path that would measure out 16,020 twin, but this got way too long, so I'm just gonna do this here. But just imagine that all these paths, they connect with each other. Sorry, Andy. So this is where the translation gets a little bit interesting. So one cycle, every 2 steps results in 50 cycles. I'll explain what that means in a bit. 13,500 breaths make a living person based on images of Warner clocks. So I'm like, what does this mean? I have no idea. And essentially what I've been thinking about is how, because these all connect with each other and because they're moving, they're units of distance as units of time. So your breath and your movement animates these paths. Okay, it's a good picture. This is not too much. All right, here we go. You know, I mentioned that I have this 16,020 swim that I mapped out last night with the help of my mom and my sister. It was a lot of ribbons. But because we couldn't, I'm going to just use this as like a model. So Andy, if you could just hold this. And then if you could, whatever we just mapped out with those meridians, let's imagine that they all connect in this circle. They're, again, units of distance is units of time is units of life, because someone is breathing. And so what does that mean? Why do meridians, or why are they linked to breath? And so another text says that exhaling moves the mind. It moves a little bit every time you exhale. It starts with exhale, and then the qi travels through twin. So as you exhale first, it moves a little bit, and then inhaling also moves the mind. So then you inhale, and then it travels another 3 twin. And then a steady inhale and exhale, the qi will travel 6 twin. So like exhale and inhale, and it'll move around like this. So what is this? You know, breaths as units of life, but what is that? Where do we get this 13 6,500 number of breaths for a living person. So 6 twin that we just measured out, 1 breath is an inhale, exhale. And then the 16,020, I'm not a math teacher, I'm really bad at explaining numbers. But like 16,020 twin divided by the 6 twin is 270 breaths. And then 270 breaths times 50 cycles is 13,500 breaths. And I'm going to call that Land's math, but really my mom checked it for me because she used to be like, anyway, it's a whole thing. So this is kind of how these numbers make sense. And actually it helped me figure out that this was, I had mistranslated 16 because in the text it says 86, but really we think this is a wrong character. So that was also part of this method. So thank you very much. We can read this here. And this also connects, we can just kind of break that. So this also connects to, you'll notice that in this part where it tells you that there's movement in the breaths and that it's a unit of time, there's also mention of water clocks. So based on the images of water clocks. So I was confused. I wasn't really sure how to translate this at first. But the water clocks that it's referencing is meant to describe every 2 steps. So, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but the water clocks it's describing is describing images of water clocks. And maybe some of you have seen clepsydras, these water clocks that are like that. They're not unique to East Asia, but water flows from one level to the other, and more importantly, it registers on this arrow that is divided into 100 ke. So a single ke is essentially there are 100 ke a day, and in Chinese now ke means 15 minutes, but historically this average is around 14.4 minutes. So this is the unit of time, ke. And so when we look at this, I've translated as steps instead of quarter of an hour, but what's interesting is that it describes that it's around 30 minutes per breath. So inhale, or exhale, and then inhale, that's 30 minutes. And for a lot of these classical texts in the 1st century, they would say this is a healthy person, as if you can find this state of sustained breathing. So 2 steps, 2 ke, about 30 minutes every inhale and exhale. But this is from a text in around the 1st century. And Wang Haopu was writing in the 13th century, and this is where I haven't finalized or refined the translation, but he says, wait a minute, actually now, 1 cycle every 4 steps, 4 ke, results in 25 cycles. And so really authors didn't bother to ask about this, but we'll start talking about 4 steps per cycle, which what he's really saying is that it's really 1 hour per breath now because our bodies are more stagnant. They're less healthy. So in the 13th century, he was actually writing from a place of extreme instability. There were lots of wars, the empire was falling apart, he was on the run. In the 12th century, there were 33 epidemics, and everyone is dying, and so he gives himself this name, Wang Haopu, which means lover of classics, because he says, if we return to the classics, we would know how to make ourselves healthier. But also he's observing that our bodies are stagnant, we're not as healthy, we don't have this ideal state, which is one way of interpreting this translation that I haven't finished yet. So what does this all mean? And I'll try to wrap up in the next couple minutes, but what we see here in this image are specific practices of accuracy, and they concern life, death, political chaos, and epidemics. But they also demonstrate how these meridians are not just medical objects, right? They're not just for therapeutics, not for kneeling and heating, but they do other things. Like even if you drink herbs, it can also animate and help move the paths. So then what? What is this? Why is this important? What happens is that this idea of a non-pathological way of thinking about the paths, it becomes fractured in the 20th century, where with institutionalization, with the rise of biomedicine, East Asian medical theory gets sectioned off as its own kind of school. You have theory here, herbs here, acupuncture here. So Shanley has written about this history. And in this fracturing, physicians get confused when they try to ask what meridians are and what they do. So this is one example. So this image this image is from a 1950s book called New Approaches to Acupuncture, Max Sebastian. Its co-author, the primary author, is this woman, Julian, who is pretty high up politically, and she finds a young illustrator, Wang Xutai, to create her lithographs. And they're making these images in dire poverty because the communist government is quite young and they can't source paper. I don't really know how they ended up making these books, but this book is a version, the earlier version of this book was 1951, where Zhu is asking Wang to illustrate meridians. And when he does, he follows her suggestion that meridians are just nerves, and so he colors them the same color. Nerves here, meridians here. And he's also agreeing with her, or there's a pretty popular discourse in China that understanding meridians as nerves builds on Pavlovian theories of excitatory and inhibitory responses, nervous responses. So they start with saying that nerves and meridians are the same thing, and they're not the first person to do this. But later on, as Wang is reading more of these classical texts, he creates new images, and then meridians become red, and these are just small details where rather than having red nerves become black. They're just ontologically different things. And he can't overtly disagree with Julian, but they start to diverge over the course of their careers. And as Wang starts to write his own books, he produces this really tiny handbook in 1966. Again, dire conditions, really poor. The book is pretty small, but he's still creating images of meridians, and he now connects them rather than fragmented on the body. They're a single path, and more importantly, he recreates an image of a meridian, a set of meridians as a connected cycle, as a connected set of paths. So if you follow any path, it just moves from one to the other, and then onto a big track. And he's doing this because he's reading all these classical texts, and he understands that, well, there's a way that all the organs are connected. They also connect the head to the feet, through the torso, through the hands. This is how the body is oriented. And so in this configuration, he's trying to make sense of how meridians are units of distance as units of time, and units of time as units of life. So this is something that he works on for the rest of his career. He tries to fixate on this idea of meridians moving, they're cosmological objects, and he ends up passing away in 2008, but before he dies, he produces this book. He's creating a lot of images. He's collecting images, producing images, and he has this book that comes out in 2003, which is an illustrated manual of Chinese acupuncture and Max Sebastian. So he's quite elderly at this point of his life, and his son also passes away. He's thinking about death, but he's also thinking about what these meridians can do, and he recruits an illustrator to create a whole chapter dedicated to cosmology. Everything relates to time, relates to divination, relates to talisman, relates to cosmology. He doesn't specialize in this because if you think about what considers how he count a day, it exists in calendars, and there are historians of almanacs who can say much more about this than I can. But Wang, at the end of his life, is trying to bring theory back into these meridian atlases. And so he fixates on units of time, and the author who writes this chapter on cosmology also reproduces his image of meridians as this whole continuous cycle, as a circular cycle. And I'm pretty sure that he's urging the reader to think about meridians not just as therapeutic objects, but as units of life. So this brings me to the end, where, again, I've been talking about just graphic representations of these paths called jingluo and jingmai. And I started the talk with thinking about how I'm limiting my analysis just to these images to acknowledge the simultaneous materiality and invisibility of corporeal structures. And measuring meridians also allows us to engage in further requires cosmological considerations that invite methodological approaches in histories of math, histories of technology, thinking about the water clock, and joining that with histories of the body. Recently, I've been trying to think about time. This is related to work that I'm thinking about at some point writing an article about medicine and the multiverse, but that's just something it's a great idea, seed of an idea, thinking about medical plurality. But when thinking about representations of time, I'm taking inspiration from the philosopher of physics, Janan Ishmael, who has argued that visual representations of time as space, so time as space and time as something that you can't step outside of, can lead to, or has led to, specific kinds of confusion. Janan Ishmael has argued that you can never step outside of time, since you're always in it. And so I take this, this just helps me think about the ontology of time, where then measuring meridians as a method of close reading these texts reveals specific kinds of accuracy that feature discrete lengths made of flexible units that are also tethered to fixed quantities of time, all of which expand on the utility of hand-drawn images or hand-drawn paths. So it just suggests that these, what we might describe as anatomical atlases, might be doing something more than we think, or maybe they're doing less than we think. So this is where I will leave you in my various thoughts about measuring meridians and time, distance, and units of life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Now we're gonna move on to...
So you don't actually see yourself.
Sure.
I just realized.
Perfect.
Very...
To take in a few minutes before we wrap up to honor, thank you, to honor the winner of our essay competition this year. So we want to recognize the winner of our prize. And first, I want to thank Cambridge University Press for their long-standing support, going on 6 years now, of this competition, which every year really draws a really fascinating and impressive array of graduate student essays from around the world. And we're really excited to have so many, to have such an interesting group. And it's a real pleasure for us to read it. There's 5 or 6 of us on the steering committee who get to read all of these essays every fall. So the field of entrance this year was very wide-ranging and elicited a significant interest from our steering committee. And after long and careful deliberation, we identified this year's clear winner as Joseph Bishop's essay, The Nutrients of Quelling a Riot, Employing Nutrition to Curb Social Unrest During New York City's 1970 Protests Against Exorbitant Food Prices. And Bishop is a history of science PhD student currently at Princeton University. His prize-winning essay is really a cogent synthesis of the histories of nutrition, biochemistry, agriculture, and social policy through the 1917 New York City food riots, which took place at a moment when creating healthy bodies and creating healthy citizens were of a piece. Through studying food in its multiple guises as a source of fuel, vital materials, and a fulcrum of urban moral economies, Bishop's essay brings new context to familiar figures in the history of nutrition, while placing them in dialogue with conversations occurring both in the halls of Washington regarding social instability and around kitchen tables regarding basic human needs. The steering committee was particularly impressed with how Bishop engaged with and interwove the literatures on nutrition science, public health, economic history, and urban politics throughout this compelling essay. And how many essays have you read that bring all of those literatures together? It's one of the things that's really special about this organization and the work that graduate students are doing and sending us, and that we're celebrating. So this essay really is a wonderful example of the dividends that come from thinking across the history of medicine, science, and health, and the broader social concerns for the nature and politics, as well as health. And sadly, Joe Bishop was planning to join us today, and his flight was canceled yesterday because of mechanical issues, so he's not here, but he actually sent me some comments thanking the steering committee for their efforts in reviewing the essays, which takes a lot of time at a busy time of the semester, so thank you to them as well. And also saying that it was really an honor to receive this recognition. He said, "I'm inspired by the work that people of this forum produce. Thank you for being a consistent source of encouragement and support for this kind of cross-sectional research. in the history of science. And so even in his absence, he may be listening in right now. Let's congratulate Joe. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here. It was really exciting to have this meeting and forum today, to hear this really amazing talk and to see you all in person. And so we'll look forward to future gatherings, and please be in touch with me with any ideas or comments that you have, which we can discuss in our steering committee. So thank you very much. Have a great conference.